Good morning, champions. Mr. Chambers here, coming to you with the third installment of the reading through Powerless. Today, I'll be reading through chapters 4 and 5. This is optional. By no means is this required. However, if you are watching the series and would like some extra credit, you can answer the question of the day in a short 3 to 5 sentence paragraph posted either on Google Classroom or on the YouTube comments. Okay, so Powerless Chapters 4 and 5. What does Daniel learn about Noble Greens that makes this town special? What makes Noble Green special? He'll learn about something here in chapters 4 and 5 that make this town special or peculiar. Okay, so again, I'm reading Powerless by Matthew Cody. This is a scholastic book that came out a few years ago, and we're starting on chapter 4. Chapter 4, The Incident at the Observatory. For the next several days, Daniel watched Rohan, Eric, and Molly very closely. In turn, they watched him. On the day after the bridge accident, Daniel followed Molly home from school, only to turn around and find Rohan was following him. Daniel had been standing across the street from Molly's house, waiting for her to... Well, he didn't know exactly, but he was sure she was up to something strange, when he heard a sneeze behind him. Sure enough, there was Rohan, looking miserable in a patch of pollen-dusted wildflowers. When pressed, Rohan claimed that his dog, Shaggy, had run off, but Daniel knew better. Daniel had seen Shaggy and was by far the oldest dog he had ever met. Shaggy wouldn't be running anywhere. Rohan was a bizarre kid, no doubt, yet despite everything, the two were fast becoming friends. But Rohan's behavior was definitely strange. Sometimes he would put on his nose clip or even stuff earplugs in his ears for no reason whatsoever, and Rohan had a tendency to zone out. He'd be in the middle of a heated defense of pirating over detective work and suddenly start staring off into space. Daniel had to practically shake him to get him to come back to Earth. Molly hung out with them occasionally, but she barely paid any attention to Daniel. Sometimes she would talk with Rohan about school or sports, but most of her time she spent with Eric. Eric, after the story of the rescue at the Tangle Creek Bridge, Daniel had decided that if there was a mystery to be solved here, the answer lay with Eric. He seemed nice enough, always smiling, always easygoing, but for some reason Daniel had been unable to work up the courage to talk to him. Daniel had noticed that Eric missed a lot of school, and he suspected that it wasn't because of illness. Whatever the case, both Molly and Rohan were fiercely protective of him. Whenever Daniel started to ask questions, they would quickly change the subject. If he pressed on, they would eventually get mad and just walk away. Daniel had the feeling that if forced to choose between their secrets and him, they would choose their secrets. All of which put Daniel into a rather foul mood during those next few weeks. His gloom and the increasingly secretive behavior of his new friends meant that when the first field trip of the year came around, he was ready for it. The visit to Mount Nobel Observatory was the one thing he'd been looking forward to since coming to Nobel's Green. The observatory belonged to the university and had one of the most powerful telescopes in the country, as well as a planetarium complete with a laser light star show. But best of all, the trip was a chance for Daniel to think about something other than his new stack of problems. When they arrived at the observatory, the students were given a half-hour tour of the museum, displays, and gift shop. Like the rest of his classmates, Daniel was itching to blow his allowance on some souvenir junk and was on his way to do just that when he saw Clay and Bud waiting for him outside the gift shop. As Bud looked his way, Daniel beat a quick retreat up a nearby staircase to avoid a potential pounding. When he reached the top, he found his way was blocked. A large sign read, "No admittance, exhibit closed for repairs," and the hall was roped off with yellow caution tape. But he didn't want to face Clay and Bud, and since there was no other way around, he slipped under the tape and went inside. The hall looked empty except for some sheets of drywall and a few power tools littering the floor. The room smelled of sawdust and fresh paint, just the sort of place that would play havoc with Rohan's allergies. Although the electricity was off, the room was bright with daylight. It poured in through a giant hole in the outside wall, where the floor ended in a sheer drop. Peeking over the side, Daniel could see that they had started to erect scaffolding several floors below. Beyond that was nothing but empty air. It was a long way down the mountain from up here. In one corner of the hall, there was a large sheet of plastic billowing in the wind. Behind it, Daniel found an intact exhibit, complete with dioramas and photographs detailing the history of Mount Nobel and the building of the observatory. Some of the photographs dated back to the beginning of the 20th century when Nobel's Green was just a burgeoning trade town. In one photograph, brown and blurry with age, a ragtag group of children with a bearded man dressed in skins and a fur cap. The caption read, "Jonathan Noble and the survivors of the St. Albans fire." This photograph was taken after the survivors emerged from the wilderness of Mount Noble. There was more written there, something about the burning of an orphanage and how its children were all saved by a local trapper named Jonathan Noble. Daniel was just beginning to read about the suspected cause of the fire when he caught the whiff of something bad, something nauseatingly familiar. Well, if it isn't Daniel, all by his lonesome. Daniel recognized the voice. It had the gravely pitch of someone used to shouting. Clay was standing there in the doorway of the little history exhibit, blocking Daniel's exit. His arms were folded in front of him, and he was wearing an ugly smile. Bud was off to his side, writing "Bud Rules" in black marker across one of the walls. This was a bad situation. Here Daniel was in a place that was off limits, with no teachers around, trapped with the two most dangerous kids in school. He didn't even have Molly to stick up for him. This time he was on his own. He remembered Clay's enemies list, and the thought made him queasy. "Where's your girlfriend?" asked Clay, looking around. Something occurred to Daniel then, giving him a tiny bit of hope that he hadn't had before. Clay was scared of something. He was being cautious, hesitant even. Maybe Rohan's threat about Eric still had a hold on the little thug, and if Daniel used it to his advantage, he just might make it out of there in one piece. "She's around," Daniel croaked. He hadn't realized it until now, but his mouth had gone dry. He wondered if they could see his legs shaking. Would they be satisfied that they had simply terrified him and leave it at that? Somehow Daniel doubted that. "In fact, Molly and Eric are on their way up here right now, so you'd better get out of my way." Then he did something either very brave or very crazy. He started walking straight toward them, as if they weren't even there. The way he figured it, he had one chance. Clay and Bud were both bigger than him, and Clay was certainly way stronger. But they weren't the brightest couple of kids. He needed to bluff them, and quick, before they recognized the lie on his face. Amazingly, it worked, or at least it started to. Bud knitted his brow, clearly thrown by Daniel's brazen approach, and backed up a step to the right, giving Daniel just enough room to squeeze by. Clay, however, stood perfectly still, watching Daniel pass. He looked as if he were thinking so hard it hurt. Daniel was maybe 3 steps past them when he heard Clay sneer. "Ah, this is bull. He's up here all alone." That's when Daniel ran. He sprinted as fast as he could on wobbly legs towards the stairs, not even daring to look back at the sound of the footsteps pursuing him. He could feel someone's hot breath on the back of his neck and tripped just as fingers grabbed at his shirt collar. Daniel skidded on his hands and knees and ended up in a pile on the floor, dangerously close to the exposed wall in the sheer drop down the mountainside. The bright sunlight was streaming in from outside, and Daniel shielded his eyes from the glare. He was dazed from his fall and blinded by the sun, but he could still hear Clay's mocking laughter somewhere in front of him. He was trapped between Clay and the deadly fall. The air around him smelled strongly of rotting stink of dead things. Nowhere to go, new kid. Might as well take what's coming to you. In a panic, Daniel got to his feet too fast and realized the room was spinning. He'd fallen harder than he'd thought, and now his vision began to go dark with spots. Stumbling and blind, he tried to back away from Clay's taunting laughter. Daniel's eyes started to clear just in time to see Clay make a desperate grab for him. Daniel lunged backward, but the look on Clay's face suddenly changed. The cruel smile disappeared, and his eyes went wide with fear. He shouted, "Wait! Look out!" But it was too late. Daniel was already taking another step back, but this time he found only empty air. Daniel's stomach dropped out from under him as he tottered over and through the exposed wall, plummeting off the side of Mount Noble. All Daniel saw was the blurry shape of the scaffolding passing by him, and all he heard was the sound of blood pounding in his ears. Despite his panic, he found himself wondering whether he would feel it when he hit, or if he could just die instantly. Then he was no longer falling. Someone had a hold of him, and that someone was floating in mid-air. He turned his head and saw Eric smiling back at him. "Hi, Daniel. I guess it's time we talked, huh?" Chapter 5. The Children of Nobel's Green. So I guess I'd better start with introductions. Well, that's Louisa and her little sister, Rose. Louisa can walk through stuff and Rose can turn invisible. That's Simon. He can do things with electricity. It's pretty cool, you'll see. You already know Rohan. Nothing gets past him. He can see and hear and smell just about anything. And of course, Molly, the best flyer there ever was. Not ever, interrupted Molly. Michael was better. The room went silent as Eric glared at Molly, but she just returned his stare. "All right," continued Eric. "Molly here is the fastest flyer there ever was, and unfortunately you've already met Clay and Bud. We don't hang out with them." Eric smiled at the last bit, and Daniel's own mouth, he knew, was still hanging wide open. He was standing in an old tree fort deep in the woods of Mount Noble, the kids' secret hideout. With 2 rooms and a tire swing, it was a massive by tree fort standards, and the supporting branches of 2 great oaks practically sagged under the weight. Newly painted boards covered up patches of rot here and there, but overall this place had been kept in excellent shape despite its obvious age and use. Freshly tied rope ladders dangled from the sides, and there was even a pirate crow's nest made from discarded roof shingles. The walls inside were covered with posters and hand-drawn pictures. Some of them were just typical kid stuff like rockets or race cars, even a few baby animals. But most were drawings of children. In crayon, finger paint, or magic marker, they were pictures of children laughing, children flying, even children lifting cars over their heads. But as intriguing as the actual pictures were, what shocked Daniel the most was just how old some of them looked. Drawn on yellowing paper with images so faded to be nearly unrecognizable. Someone had been drawing these for many, many years. "That's all of us, Daniel," Eric finished. "The supers of Nobel's Green." "Man, I hate it when he says things like that," said Simon. A plump boy with spiky blonde hair, he mumbled it under his breath, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. But Eric just ignored him and turned to Daniel. "So," he said, "what do you think?" What Daniel wanted to say right then was, "I think you've all gone super insane, and I'm right there with you." But he didn't. He thought he should at least try being polite to the boy who had, earlier that day, saved his life. After saving Daniel from the terrible fall, Eric had carried him, flown him around the side of the observatory to a safe landing spot. Molly was there to greet them. She looked worried, but Daniel wondered whether she was concerned about his safety or about the fact that he now knew Eric's secret. His head was spinning from the shock of it all. Eric saw the look on his face. "Listen, Daniel, I know you're pretty freaked out right now, but I need you to stay cool for a while, okay? I promise I'll tell you everything you want to know later, but right now we need to act like nothing happened, All right, Daniel. Daniel's heart still felt as if it were going to burst from his chest, but despite it all, he almost laughed in Eric's face. What choice did Eric think he had? Should he go tell a teacher that a super bully and his smelly sidekick had chased him out a hole on the top of the observatory? But since a flying super kid caught him, now everything was okay? Molly stepped forward and put her hand on Daniel's shoulder. Please, Daniel, I promise we'll tell you everything. Just a little later. And with that touch, Daniel's heart stopped racing, and he was able to catch his breath and calm down. He was still in shock, but Molly's hand was reassuring. Yeah, he said, nodding. Okay, we'll talk later. Eric smiled. Great, Daniel. Be at your bedroom window tonight around 9 o'clock. We'll meet you there. Eric paused while he and Molly exchanged looks. And thanks, Daniel, for trusting us. Eric and Daniel returned to the observatory and snuck into the planetarium where the rest of the class was already watching the star show. Eric leaned back in his chair and grinned at the many colored lights overhead. But for Daniel, it all went by in a blur. When they got back to the bus, Rohan was waiting for them. He looked genuinely relieved to see Daniel alive and well. Man, oh man, he was saying. Are you all right? Daniel nodded and then climbed aboard the bus silent. Behind him, Rohan was still muttering, man, oh man. Just as the bus was about to pull away, Clay and Bud dragged themselves on board, but stared at his shoes as he walked, and the air around him was strangely odor-free. But Clay held his head high, defiant. When they walked by Daniel's seat, Clay leaned down and whispered, What were you thinking backing out of that window? You some kind of maniac? You almost got us in a whole mess of trouble. Daniel was dumbfounded. Was Clay actually blaming him for falling out of the window? Daniel muddled through the rest of the day in a near state of shock. At 9:05 p.m., he saw Eric and Molly standing outside in his yard in the shadow of his house. He cautiously waved down to them and Molly called back, Ready? But they didn't wait for his answer. They just lifted off the ground and floated up to Daniel's window. Eric reached out an arm to Daniel. Want to take a trip? Daniel hesitated and Eric said, You'll be perfectly safe. Trust me. It was like one of those trust exercises where you fall back into your friend's arms, hoping they will be there to catch you, only Daniel was stepping out of the third-story window and Eric was not his friend. Not yet, anyway. And then he just closed his eyes and jumped. Eric put Daniel on his back and told him to hang on tight, and then the three of them were off, flying over the trees and houses, soaring through the dark. Molly shouted above the rushing wind, See you there, and sped off ahead of them. Show off, Eric said as he and Daniel followed a good distance behind her, drifting through the night sky over Nobel's green, toward the dark woods of the mountainside. Now Daniel was sitting in the secret tree fort of a bunch of super kids. So Daniel, said Eric, what do you think? Daniel looked around at the kids' expectant faces. Are you joking? Eric laughed. He was the type who laughed easily and often, and Daniel was finding it almost impossible not to smile along with him. But until he found some answers, he was determined to try. So you all have... Daniel tried to think of a word that wouldn't sound as ridiculous as the one that popped into his head, but he couldn't. So you all have superpowers? Wow, what gave it away? Maybe it was the flying boy who brought you here, said the kid with the spiky hair, Simon. Turning to Eric, he let out a loud chuckle. You sure you didn't drop this one on his head? Save it, Simon, said Eric. Yes, Daniel, we all have superpowers, Rohan said. Well, I like to think of them as extra normal abilities. And Rohan's power is that he is a super nerd, offered Simon. Simon, shouted Molly and Eric at the same time. Daniel shook his head and rubbed his eyes with the palms of his hands. This was all way too much to take in. Here he was somewhere in the wilds of Mount Noble talking to a bunch of super kids in their treehouse of justice, or whatever. This could have been any ordinary group of kids huddled around their flashlights on a sleepover, but for the fact that there was nothing ordinary about these kids. Of that, at least, Daniel was sure. How? I mean, this is all impossible, right? Rohan, said Eric, would you do the honors? Sure thing, said Rohan, standing. Eric gave Rohan the floor and sat down in his spot. Well, Daniel, Rohan continued, the truth is that we don't really know how we got these abilities, but we do know that there have been kids like this, us in Nobel's Green, for a very, very long time. Kids only? Asked Daniel. You mean aren't any adults like your parents aren't? Heck no, all the adults here are as normal as you are. My parents would ground me until college if they found out. Go ahead, said Molly. Tell him what happens. I'm getting there, Moll. First things first. See, Daniel, Rohan went on, for a long time Nobel's Green has been a special place. For years, certain children here have been displaying these special abilities. Some of us thinks it goes back hundreds of years or more, but no one's really sure. What we do know is that each generation of special children passes down the 4 rules to the next. What rules? Rohan pointed his flashlight at Eric, who took over. First rule, use your powers to help. Never hurt. Next, Rohan turned the spotlight on Louisa, who said softly, second rule, the north face and the old quarry are off limits. Danger waits for us there. Then came Molly. She seemed reluctant at first, but Eric gave her a little nudge in the ribs and she stood up. Third rule, it ends at 13. Finally, Rohan turned the light back on himself, and most important, the fourth rule, never, ever let grown-ups know. Not even Clay will break that one, said Eric. So, wait a minute, said Daniel. You all were born with superpowers and a bunch of rules to go with them, like an instruction manual? The Super's how-to book? We weren't born with them, said Eric, patiently ignoring Daniel's sarcasm. They show up in us at different times. Rose here is the youngest that I know of. I'm 5.5, she shouted, smiling big. And Eric tells me the rules so I can tell them to other super kids someday. And Michael told them to him, and somebody told them to Michael. Rose looked a lot like her older sister, Louisa. Dark skin, pretty black hair, worn long, and a friendly face. Unlike Molly, when the two sisters saw Daniel staring, they answered him with welcoming smiles. The point is that these rules have been around forever, continued Eric. Like the drawings and this 4 kids have been passing them on to each other for years and years. Everyone follows the rules. Not everyone, said Molly. Well, yeah, there is the occasional bad apple. Daniel knew right away who they were talking about. The memory of Clay chasing him off the top of the observatory was still painfully fresh. Tell him the rest, said Molly. Tell him about the third rule. Rohan gave Molly a tired look. All right, Moll, all right. See, Daniel, the reason there are no adults like us is because of the third rule. It ends at 13. No one keeps their powers past their 13th birthday. You mean you can give up your powers? Asked Daniel. Just like that? No, not exactly. We don't give them up. The truth is, we don't know what really happens. We don't know how we got these powers. We also don't know how we lose them. But when I wake up on my 13th birthday, I will be just like you, and with no memory of ever even having powers. It all just disappears. Just like that, Simon said. You go to sleep special, and you wake up just a regular dweeb like everyone else? This time Eric kicked Simon right in the shin. Ow! He yelped. What did you do that for? Oh. Daniel's face was red. He could feel it. Everyone was looking at him. The regular dweeb was blushing. Yeah, whatever. Sorry, said Simon. never mind. It's no sweat, answered Daniel. But what else could he say? It was true. Here he was, just an ordinary kid standing in a room full of superheroes. He felt very small indeed. But the feeling didn't squelch Daniel's natural curiosity. A secret group of super children, a set of mysterious rules passed on from kid to kid. None of this made any sense. So where did these rules come from? I mean, who wrote them? Tell him about Johnny, said a voice in Daniel's ear. But when he turned to ask who this Johnny person was, no one was there. Johnny, tell him, repeated the empty air. Rose, you know better than to talk to someone when they can't see you. It's not polite, said Louisa. She came over and sat next to Daniel, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the empty space immediately next to him. Rose appeared only inches away from Daniel's face. Sorry. Who's Johnny? Asked Daniel, trying not to appear startled by Rose's sudden appearing act. Louisa answered for her sister. Johnny Noble. He was the first of us, and he was the writer of the rules, we think. He was a real, true superhero. It's only a legend, said Molly. Well, actually, there is some evidence, Rohan put in. Daniel interrupted them. The kids here had a habit of talking to him as if he had some idea of what was going on. It was getting irritating. Jonathan Noble? You mean the guy the town is named after? He was more than that, said Eric. Much more. Daniel heard some rustling behind him and turned to see Rose digging around in an old trunk in the corner. She returned with a large stack of what looked like comic books, which she very carefully placed in front of him. Even though they were wrapped in plastic, Daniel could still smell the age on them. Despite Louisa's flashlight, Daniel had trouble making out the details in the dark. We need some more light, Eric said. Simon? With a grin, Simon began furiously rubbing his palms together as Daniel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The room began to smell like the air before a thunderstorm. Electricity, remembered Daniel. There was a tiny flutter of light, then another and another. Within a few minutes, the treehouse was lit by 20 or so little glowing spheres of energy, each one no bigger than a golf ball. They crackled and popped as they floated above the children's heads. Whoa, said Daniel. They're my wisps, said Simon, smiling proudly. But don't touch them, warned Louisa, or you'll get yourself a little shock. Stingers, said Rose. You bunch of babies, said Simon, but Daniel noticed that he wasn't touching them either. By the light of Simon's wisps, Daniel saw that the comic books were indeed old, yellowed and faded with age. Little Rose leaned over Daniel's shoulder and pointed. Johnny Noble, she whispered. Across the top of every book, printed in big, bold letters, was the title, Fantastic Futures, starring Johnny Noble. The hero of every cover was a masked man in a skin-tight red shirt and black pants. In each drawing, he was doing some different heroic deed, but most of them involved fighting Nazi tanks or punching out Axis soldiers. All these comics were obviously from World War II era, but were in relatively good shape considering their years. They were probably worth a small fortune. Daniel was confused. There were comic books about a superhero character named Johnny Noble, but Jonathan Noble was a real man, flesh and blood. He was a local hero, sure, and while Daniel assumed there were a few tall tales about him, like the one about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, he was definitely a real man. Daniel remembered the photo he saw hanging in the observatory, but the character in these comics was shown doing impossible things like lifting 3-ton tanks and flying. Yeah, impossible things like flying. You're trying to tell me that this is the same guy? That Jonathan Noble, the hero of Nobel's Green, is also known as Johnny Noble, a superhero from World War II. Eric sat down next to Daniel and took one of the books from him. Very gently, he removed it from its protective wrapper and opened it, careful not to put too much pressure on the pages. On the cover was an illustration of Johnny Noble in the dark forest, jumping from foxhole to foxhole and tearing up machine gun nests and enemy barbed wire. Eric, said Daniel, Those are comic books, not history books. Daniel found himself pacing around the room. His earlier shock had worn off and his logical detective mind was taking over. Eric just shook his head. There's more, Daniel. Among the supers, there has always been a legend of a boy who grew up and kept his powers. The story goes that one of the first of us was so strong and so heroic that he reached 13 and he kept his powers. See, it's like a test. We were given these powers and we have to prove that we are responsible enough to keep them. We have to prove that we are heroes. And why do you think that this boy, the one who grew up, is Johnny Noble? Rohan took the book from Eric. Well, obviously no one knows for sure, but it's a theory. Rohan was interrupted by a choking, gasping sound, and Daniel turned to see Simon sticking a finger down his throat. Oh, don't mind me, said Simon. I'm just going to make myself vomit if these two don't shut up soon. Eric folded his arms across his chest and sighed. Simon looked pleased with himself. Okay, said Daniel, rubbing his eyes. Answer this. If there really was some kind of superhero fighting on our side during World War II, some super who grew up and decided to fight crime and the whole thing, why haven't we heard about it? You'd think it might have been mentioned someplace other than a bunch of comics? Eric shrugged. Why haven't we heard the truth about aliens and UFOs and ghosts and Bigfoot and stuff? It's the government. It's all over the television and how the government is keeping things like that a secret. Well, what if they decided they wanted to keep him a secret too? But someone here knew about him and published his stories in a way that guaranteed that kids in Nobel's Green would read about him. Comics. The government probably erased all evidence of Johnny Noble's existence when he refused to keep working for them after the war, or something like that. Eric set down the copy of Fantastic Futures very gently, almost reverently. Now all we have are these few. Of everything Daniel had heard here in this tree fort turned secret hideout, this was perhaps the hardest to swallow. It must have been a terrible thing to be special and have no idea why. Graham was fond of saying that everyone was looking for their purpose in life, but only a few found it. These were probably the most special children on the face of the planet, and they were clinging to a bunch of old comics and conspiracy theories for answers. In Nobel's Green, kids might fly, but comic books were still just comic books. But Daniel was too exhausted and far too overwhelmed to keep talking. Let Eric and Rose and all the rest hold on to the hope that they, maybe, just maybe, they might make it past their 13th birthday with their powers intact and grow up to be a real superhero like Johnny Noble. What was the harm in dreaming? Daniel was tired of asking questions, and tired of believing in the unbelievable. But he still had one last question that needed answering, and it was perhaps the most important one of all. Why me? What do you mean? Asked Eric. Why tell me all this? I'm not like you. I can't do any of those things you do. So why share this all with me? You didn't have to save me. You could have let me fall and your secret would have been safe. Eric stood up and looked Daniel in the eye. He was no longer smiling. It's the first rule, he said, and it's one that I take very seriously. Use your powers to help, never hurt. I think your death would have hurt a lot of people, Daniel. Me, for starters, said Rohan. We're friends, Daniel, aren't we? Daniel glanced around the room full of smiling faces. He was very uncomfortable again and could feel himself squirming under all that attention. I know it's been hard these last few days, continued Rohan, and that you had questions I couldn't answer, but the truth is we just weren't sure what to do about you. We knew you were catching on, but we don't have any friends that are, well, not like us. Then when Eric saw you in trouble, there was really no decision left to make. So now it's up to you, Daniel, said Eric. You know all about us, and what you do with that information is your call. We can't stop you if you decide to tell. Daniel was just about to disagree with Eric with all their powers. Daniel figured they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. When Rose appeared again at his side, never hurt, she whispered. Daniel looked at them all. Rohan was smiling. Eric was grinning too. The others looked anxious, even a little afraid, even the loudmouthed Simon. Only Molly was hard to read. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't wearing her usual scowl either. She was just watching, curious as a cat. Yeah, I guess your secret's safe with me, answered Daniel. What else could he say? Great, shouted Eric, slapping him on the back. Daniel could feel the power behind it. I knew Rohan was right. I knew we could trust you, Daniel Corrigan. Yeah, great. Go team, said Daniel. But it's getting a little late. Do you think we should call it a night and I could maybe, I don't know, get a ride home? Sure, Eric laughed. Glad to. I'll be your limo and chauffeur all in one. Eric opened the tree fort door and they stepped out onto a narrow wooden porch. From the vantage point, they could see down the side of the mountain and up into the night sky. It was a bright blanket of stars. Eric put his hand gently this time on Daniel's shoulder and gave it a little squeeze. Only this time, you should try keeping your eyes open because there's really nothing like it, Daniel. Nothing at all. Okay, so that concludes our reading of Powerless, chapters 4 and 5 this week. And as a reminder for extra credit points in the comments below or on Google Classroom, you can write a short 3 to 5 sentence paragraph answering this question. What does Daniel learn about Noble Green that makes this town special? Thank you for tuning in. I'll be catching in with you shortly. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.